So, are you a fan of Pride and Prejudice? And if so, can you tell me how much money Mr. Darcy makes every year? Would you say £10,000? If so, you would be giving the most traditional answer because, of course, Pride and Prejudice does talk about £10,000. But does Darcy really make $10,000 a year? Like, really? Well, that's what we're going to be delving in here today. We're going to be analyzing what the book says about his income, and we're going to be putting it in its historical context. So if you want to discover how much Darcy actually has every year, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. Following my channel for a while, you may have seen my video on Why is Mr. Darcy So Rich, where I break down the different ways that gentlemen made income during this time period. And of course, if you've seen that video, then you might notice that I am wearing the same outfit. It's outfit recycling time. Because I wanted to do something special for this video because it's coming out on my 4-year YouTube anniversary. That's right, my channel has existed for 4 years now, and the very first video I ever published was, Why is Mr. Darcy so rich? So I thought it'd be fitting if I wore the same outfit and talked about Mr. Darcy's wealth again. But today we're delving so much deeper into his money than ever before. Let's dive into it. So first up, let's really analyze what the book has to say about this $10,000 a year, because it's actually very interesting. The first time we ever hear Mr. Darcy connected with this concept that he has $10,000 a year is when he shows up at that ball, the one where he insults Elizabeth as not being handsome enough to tempt him. And when he walks in the room, this is what the book says about him. It says, Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance of his having $10,000 a year. Okay. So here we have, within 5 minutes of Darcy entering the room, the general gossip mill at the ball is already circulating that he has £10,000. And the big question becomes, where did the gossipers get that information? Now, the book never tells us where they got the information, but I highly doubt it was from Mr. Darcy himself. I don't see Mr. Darcy entering the room and being like, yep, got $10,000 a year. And if Mr. Darcy isn't telling people, then who is? Did somebody in the room recognize him and, having previously heard gossip about his income, be able to supply the general populace with that information? Or perhaps at some point earlier in the day or week, some of the Netherfield servants had spread that gossip among the shopkeepers in town, and that got back to the assembly rooms too. Or could somehow possibly one of the Bingley sisters let it slip how much he was worth? Though I also don't imagine that happening. Really, we have no clue where this figure of £10,000 is coming from, nor how credible it is, because again, it's just gossipy rumor at this point. So now what do we have? We have Mr. Darcy plus £10,000 on very shaky, uncredible ground. Now let's see the next instance of where we hear about his £10,000. And that actually comes from a very interesting source, which is, of course, Mr. Wickham. Here is what Mr. Wickham tells Elizabeth. When she asks about Darcy's estate, he says, "Yes," replied Mr. Wickham, "his estate there is a noble one, a clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Okay, so here Mr. Wickham is saying, I'm a credible source. You can trust me. because my dad was a land steward. I have intimate knowledge of how much Pemberley makes. And really, he is a reliable source of that information if, of course, he decides to tell the truth about it. And of course, how Mr. Wickham works, he likes to create his stories a careful mixture of truth that adds some credibility to it, and then lies he inserts, so that his overall story appears more believable to people. And so I do feel like him saying that Pemberley makes $10,000 a year is one of the truths he's trying to tell Elizabeth for his credibility. So basically, it's coming down to the fact that we finally have a semi-reliable source saying that Darcy's estate generates $10,000 per year. So now let's really analyze what Wickham has to say about this £10,000 because it actually tells us a lot. The first thing is the fact that this £10,000 is coming off of Darcy's estate, which means the land that he owns. He's essentially this giant landlord. He's getting rents in from everything from houses in small villages to large farming establishments. They're all paying him rent. And he also might be making money off of using some of his own land to grow crops and sell those. Of course, somebody else is doing all the actual farming work for him there. But whatever the case, the money that the estate is generating is mostly from rents and agriculture. And that's where this £10,000 is coming from. Now, the second thing that Wickham says is the fact that it is a clear $10,000 per annum. Now, this leads to two different factors. One is that when gentlemen give their incomes during this time period, usually that income is their after-tax income. So that £10,000 is what Darcy actually has to live on after taxes, tithes, arrears, and maintenance on the properties that he owns are deducted. So this means that the Pemberley estate is actually generating more money than that £10,000, but the £10,000 is just what Darcy gets to keep. And the other thing about this clear $10,000 per annum means that Darcy is making at least £10,000 a year off of his estate. Now, why is that important to note? Well, because during this time period, land-owning gentlemen's income fluctuated partially due to something called arrears, which is when their tenants are behind on their rent. So, for example, sometimes gentlemen would project their future income and they'd be like, I should have £8,000 coming in this year. But because not all of their tenants are good at actually paying their rent, they might only get £6,000 in that year. And so even though they should be making $8,000, they're only getting $6,000. And maybe in the next year they get $6,400. The year after that they get $5,800. So they're not even reaching that $8,000, right? But by saying $10,000 clear, what Wickham is saying is even when you account for people not paying their rent on time, or maybe not paying at all, Darcy is still safely breaking that 10,000 point, which is saying a lot when it comes to money during this time period. Now I need to point something out about Wickham's information in general, though. As we learn in that letter that Darcy writes to Elizabeth at Rosings, Mr. Darcy's dad died about 5 years ago. Mr. Wickham's dad died not long after that. So from that point 5 years ago, Darcy and Wickham went their separate ways. Now, why is this important? Well, that means that Wickham's information about how much Pemberley estate generates is at least 5 years old. That would be the last time that he was intimate enough with the Pemberley family to have a clear understanding of their estate finances. So you might be saying, okay, so his information is 5 years old. What difference does that make? Well, during this time period, it actually makes a lot of difference. And it brings us down to this really important question too, which is, in what year is Pride and Prejudice set? So the question of what year Pride and Prejudice is set in is something that, of course, scholars have been grappling with for many, many years. And the basic answer is we don't actually know what year Pride and Prejudice is set in. But here are a couple possibilities. One is that it is set in 1797, when Jane Austen was writing the first draft of Pride and Prejudice, which at the time was called First Impressions. So that's possibility one, 1797. The The second possibility is in the year 1811, which is when Jane Austen revised Pride and Prejudice shortly before getting it published. She revised it in 1811/1812. Now, why this is so important when it comes to how much money Darcy makes is because the difference between 1797 and 1811 is actually huge when it comes to gentry family income. This was during the time period when England was at war with Napoleon's France, and the economy was going through very, very high and rapid inflation. And this rapid inflation affected different sectors of the economy in different ways. And the people who benefited the most from this inflation was land-owning families. In fact, between 1795 and 1815, their incomes from land and agriculture went up 90%. So if you were earning 1,000 pounds in 1795, by 1815, you were now earning 1,900 pounds because, again, your income went up 90%. Meanwhile, the cost to run a household and an estate only went up between 25 and 33%. So if you combine that and see the fact that their income is going up 90%, but their expenses are only going up 33% at the most, here you see them getting very, very rich. And in fact, this inflation of the country gentleman's income kept increasing and increasing in the early half of the 1800s, and it didn't nosedive until the late 1800s. So even as they head into the 1820s, these landlords can keep charging higher rents. Meanwhile, for the average person during this time period, their income was not going up that much. And then in the 1820s, if it had gone up during this time, in a lot of places, such as servants, it started actually going down. So the early 1800s was really a time when these rich guys were just getting richer and the rest of everybody wasn't following along suit. So then the question now comes down to, okay, but what does this have to do with Mr. Darcy? And the answer is, depending on what year Pride and Prejudice is set, it could have a dramatic impact on Darcy. So if Jane Austen had never updated the incomes and the year that Pride and Prejudice was set from when she wrote it in 1797, this means that by the time it was published in 1812, Mr. Darcy's inflated income at that time would be around £16,000. Now, why is this important? Well, one thing that has always sort of stumped Austen scholars is, why does Mr. Darcy only have £10,000 when Mr. Rushworth in Mansfield Park have £12,000? It doesn't really seem to make sense with their characters of why Mr. Rushworth has more than Mr. Darcy. If this is true that Jane Austen never updated the story from the economics of 1797, then the basic answer here would be that Mr. Rushworth has more money because he's in a different era. But if you inflate Darcy's income up to that era, Darcy still has more. Again, he would have $16,000 compared to Mr. Rushworth's $12,000. So that is one possibility and a possible answer to the age-old Darcy-Rushworth conundrum. So let's look at the second scenario now of if Jane Austen did update the incomes and it is set in 1811. Does this mean that Darcy makes £10,000 a year in 1811? Well, again, we have to factor in the Wickham factor. So if he's giving Darcy's income in 1811, but it's information from 5 years ago, that means he's actually giving Darcy's information from the year 1806. And of course, in that 5-year period, Darcy's income would have went up. In fact, he'd now be making around $11,500 a year by 1811. But Wickham wouldn't know that because, again, he doesn't have access to Darcy's financial information anymore. Anyway, so here we even see Darcy making more money by 1811. 11. And what's interesting is, again, even assuming that information is from 1806, if I take it up to 1813 to match it up against Mr. Rushworth, in 1813, Darcy's income would have inflated up to £12,000 a year, which would put him on par exactly with Mr. Rushworth. So I just thought that was really interesting that Jane Austen lived during this time period where incomes were so volatile and going up so dramatically for gentlemen at the time. And here is just an interesting side note for all of you people out there that love to imagine Darcy and Elizabeth's life after they're married, is the fact that when Darcy and Elizabeth get married, he's rich, of course, but he's about to get richer because, as I said, the incomes for these guys just kept going up and up and up. Darcy and Elizabeth would have just enjoyed continuing greater and greater prosperity. But now I want to talk about something else, which is Darcy's other sources of income. So remember, Wickham said that £10,000 is coming off of Darcy's noble estate. But really, a man of Darcy's income would not just have the income off of his estate. He would have the income off of his estate, and then he would have various other revenue streams, as we call them today, but he would have stocks, bonds, investments, business ventures that he's backing, and things like that that would bring him in additional money, possibly a few £1,000s worth. Really, it would have been extremely unusual for Darcy not to have these other investments. And what's interesting is that gentlemen recorded the money they earned off of their investments separately from the money they earned off of their estate. And so when Wickham is giving us that information about Darcy's estate, he's not telling us anything about the money that Darcy gets off of his investments, which could add quite a chunk on top of it. And of course, one of the big investments that Darcy would have made during this time period was investing a like into this video. I'm sure he would have completely and in a genteel fashion pressed the like button, which if you would want to follow his example and like this video, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. So really, combined with these two factors, what we've learned is that Wickham's information does not cover the full scope of how much money Darcy actually gets every year. And two, I just want to note about the fact that this is his annual income we're talking about, which is different from his total worth. And of course, a lot of his worth is coming from things that have been handed down to him from generation after generation and built upon, which is of course how these rich families got so rich. They used those rules of primogeniture. They kept giving all the wealth primarily to the oldest son until it would amass into this huge fortune. So one thing, of course, Darcy owns is all of this land. So he has to own at least between 10,000 to 15,000 acres of land based off of the income he's getting from his estate. Also, he has Pemberley, which is a house that has been generations of work. It has an impressive art gallery. It has a library. His family probably owns a house in town. His total worth is a complete side point to how much money he makes every year, but I just thought it was important to note that it is different from his annual income. Just to sum up this whole video is that Mr. Darcy's £10,000 is the low end of how much this guy actually got every year. And as we looked at, there are several ways that he probably definitely had more. Which of course is great to know, but then the question comes up is, okay, so he has 10,000 plus a year, but is that impressive? Is that like super rich, just kind of rich, not really rich at all? How rich relatively to the world he lived in was Mr. Darcy? And that is a brilliant question, and I'm going to answer that in a future video. So definitely subscribe if you want to learn whether Mr. Darcy's 10,000 plus was actually that impressive or not. Let me know in the comments below how much you think the fact that Darcy had 10,000 plus a year affected Elizabeth's decision to marry him. Do you think it had no effect? Do you think that she was kind of odd? Let me know down in the comments below. And keep having an awesome day, because you're awesome. Bye!